Coronavirus pandemic poses numerous HR challenges for employers throughout the country. Redundancies, shutdowns, working from home are just some of the obstacles that face businesses during the pandemic. Joining us is Joydeep Hor, the founder of People and Culture, to tell us what employers need to know. Joydeep, a really interesting time in the market at the moment for employers on exactly how to scale back their staff, the difference between a stand down and a redundancy, and I notice even more changes overnight to allow staff to take pandemic leave, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of critical questions for employers to have to deal with at very uncertain times. I mean, I'm sure there's been plenty of discussion over the last few days, as there has been since the beginning of this, around the sheer uncertainty. One can't plan for one's operations, let alone what the implications are going to be for one's people. At one extreme, you can let a whole heap of people go, as we've seen a number of organisations do already, professional services firms in the last 24, 48 hours. Some very big name organisations have done that. Thinking about other options, whether you can stand people down because you satisfy the criteria under the legislation for such a stand down. Other options in terms of directing people to take leave. The JobKeeper initiative has changed the dynamics of some of those choices, or the parameters for some of those choices for employers. But yeah, it's a very difficult time.
Yeah, and also the ability to cut staff back as well. This using this variation of terms section in most people's employment contract that cut people's hours back or pay back, or the choice between the two, whether you can do it or not.
That's right. So it's a time when I think one of the biggest things we're seeing with our clients at the moment is that a lot of employers are making a lot of assumptions, and some of those assumptions are quite dangerous to be making. I think the biggest assumption employers are making at the moment is they're thinking that, well, because everyone knows what's going on, because everyone is well across the situation, in inverted commas, that everyone should understand that employers have to make tough choices, and everyone should assume that if your employer comes to you and says, I need you to take leave without pay or unpaid leave, or I need you to take your annual leave, or whatever it might be, or take a reduction in your salary, that you as an employee should just understand that because of the situation, that's something you have to do. Very dangerous for an employer to make those kinds of assumptions, because while there are changes being made to industrial instruments such as awards and some changes at legislative level, people's contracts are still contractual arrangements that contain obligations for both the employer and the employee. And when you're talking about someone's pay situation that is set out in that contract, you can only change that contract with the consent of the employee. Now, as much as you might have a very valid, compelling business and commercial reason for doing so, that doesn't mean that you bypass the obligations, or can bypass the obligations, to seek that particular consent. And it's a huge problem for employers, and one that may not really rear its head for a couple of weeks. But what's going to happen over the next few weeks and months is that as the pain points for people start to really sheet home, that's usually when employees start to feel the resentment. And that resentment's worse when you are working from home, you don't have holidays to look forward to, and you don't have social engagements with people, and all the things that have kept you sane for probably most of your life are out the window. And that's when people litigate or threaten to litigate. And that's not something that the government's ever going to be able to protect you from unless the entire legal system that's been in place for centuries gets overhauled.
Joydeep, what about for all those companies who are employing people who do need to, they can't work from home? What are the legal obligations that employers have to provide what would be considered a safe workplace?
Well, I think that the guidance critically is to ensure that if you are in a situation where your employees can't work from home, and ultimately that is a matter for an employer to consider, and it's the employer that determines where employees can and can't work from, not employees. But if it's the employer's view that work cannot be done from home, and they're able to substantiate and validate that view, then their obligations are to ensure at all times that employees are safe and without risk to their health. And of course, some instructive guidance comes from the requirements that have been stipulated around appropriate working spaces and social distancing, and the 4 square metre rule, and all of those things which have to apply in working environments as much as they do anywhere else, unless you're covered by one of the very limited exemptions. So you still have all of your obligations towards your employees if they're going to be coming into your workplace to ensure their health, safety and welfare at all times.
Yeah. Because I imagine, once we get through this and sadly, if people, are coming into work and they do contract this virus, it's going to be very difficult to be able to figure out, did they contract it in the workplace? Did they contract it, somewhere else, on the bus, on the way to work? And employers can, only do so much to sort of figure that out. Are you anticipating that there might be sort of legal action or anything like this, down the track?
We have been aware of a spike in workers' compensation claims that have been made by employees. Now, some of those are going to be played out through the system. We certainly are hearing feedback that a very small number may be accepted claims by insurers. But all of these things will, as you say, they'll be things that will be determined on their own facts and their own circumstances. Employers do need to be careful, and certainly the guidance that's been given by most employers, certainly most sensible employers, that if anyone is feeling unwell at all, even at a low threshold level, then the prudent thing for that person to be doing is not to be coming into work. Now, of course, for a lot of employers, that's now been superseded by the working from home instruction or direction that they've provided. But those directives remain very, very safe. So you should still be erring on the side of caution when it comes to any health exposure to your employees. Absolutely.
Yep. And basically, what you're saying, Joydeep, is that once this goes on longer than most people think, they expect to and be prepared for employees to come back and say, well, that concession I agreed to a month ago, I'm not so sure anymore. I want it reversed back again. I'm withdrawing my consent.
That's something that absolutely could happen. And I think, what's really going to be the hard thing for employers to stay on top of and manage through this, particularly where their workforce or a majority of their workforce are working from home, is the psychological evolution and how that's going to play out for employees. You've got to remember that the other big picture thing that's happening for employees from a career perspective is a lot of that natural mobility, if I could call it that progression that might happen in your own workplace, the pay rises, the bonuses, the rewards, the incentives, the recognition. All of that's going to be put on hold to a significant extent, even if not completely. The testing of the market to see if there's a better job out there for you, that's going to be put on hold. A lot of the natural motivators and inclinations that people have to stay engaged are going to be taken away from them. So what happens to that restless energy that is created in a person's mind? You start to look for people to blame. You start to resent what your employer is doing. You start to resent things that are happening in the world. And I think that, unfortunately, while we don't talk about it that much, there are going to be societal consequences as a result of this. There is going to be an increase in crime. There is going to be an increase in suicide. There's going to be all sorts of things that will happen. And it's a word of caution to the government that they talk about the balance between managing the health issue and the economic issue, but they have to manage the societal issue as well. Because otherwise the consequences of this are going to be far more devastating than anyone is contemplating.
Joydeep, absolutely fascinating. We've run out of time. We've got to move on. We need to let you go. I want to get you back with some strategies for employers to really, how do you deal with your staff to make sure they're along for the ride over the next 6 months or so, and some strategies we should be adopting to put a really positive experience on this between employees and employers. So hopefully we can get you back on in the next week or so.
Would welcome the opportunity, Kochi. Thanks very much.
All right, Joydeep, thank you for that. Joydeep Hor there, People and Culture.